So Auckland's housing crisis, plummeting dairy prices, and a report card from the OECD that says we've got plenty to work on. It all sounds a little bit doom and gloom for our economy. One expert once described New Zealand, as you would know, it's been quoted so many times, as having a rock star economy. Is that still the case? HSBC chief economist, Australia and New Zealand, Paul Bloxham, the man responsible for that phrase, joins me now. Paul, good morning to you. Thanks for joining us at your very early hour.
Good morning. How are you?
Very well, thanks. All right, let's walk ourselves through some of these things. The most important thing is, do you still believe New Zealand right now, today, has a rock star economy?
We do. We think New Zealand still is a rock star economy. You are still outperforming most of the developed world, and that's really what we meant by that phrase in the first place. Growth is running at about 3%. That's still rapid growth relative to the rest of the developed world. You are one of the fastest growing economies in the developed world at the moment. So yes, we think 2015 has been an encore for the rock star story.
Okay, we'll look ahead in just a moment, but let's look at a couple of the things that will perhaps be some reason why some of the people who are listening to you now and watching you now think this guy doesn't know what he's talking about. The housing crisis. We are cranking on about the Auckland housing crisis so much at the moment. It leads most of our news bulletins. Do you believe that it is actually a crisis? Is it a bubble that is going to burst?
Look, I don't think it's a crisis in the way that you described that. Demand is strong for housing, and supply has been weaker than it should be, so house prices are rising very strongly in Auckland. They're probably running a little bit faster than they should in a sustainable sense, but that rise in house prices is benefiting most of the population of Auckland. Most of the people are owners of property, and of course those people are benefiting from rising house prices. Sure, it's got a bit too much exuberance, but this is not something that's unique to Auckland either. It's not just happening in New Zealand. It's happening in all of the major cities around the world. It's happening in Sydney, it's happening in New York, it's happening in Hong Kong, it's happening in London. It's not a consequence of something that's just specific to New Zealand. Demand is strong, interest rates are low globally, and so I am concerned that it doesn't run too much further and it doesn't run too much more quickly, but I don't think you'd describe it as a crisis at this point.
One of the things, obviously, when we look at the housing market, that the wowzers point to is the fact that it can't continue going up like this. Inevitably, the bubble will burst and it will be a financial crisis for us. But that isn't inevitable, is it? It can't go up like this, that is true. But the bubble doesn't necessarily have to burst, does it?
Well, there are elements of this that are true and elements that are a stretch. And the main element here is the fundamentals do support rising house prices in Auckland. Demand is strong. Why is demand strong? Well, there's inward flow of migrants. There's population growth. There's foreign interest in buying into the housing market, and interest rates are still below what we regard as neutral levels. So there's plenty of capital available, and that's faced with supply that, although it's been picking up, hasn't been picking up fast enough. Now, those are fundamental drivers of rising house prices. Now, whether 17 or 19% growth is the right number, it probably isn't. It probably is running a little faster than it should, but there are fundamentals that are underpinning rising house prices in Auckland. So the story is not quite as bad, I think, as some of the more sceptical commentary suggests.
So what you're saying for it is not complete runaway. There are some tangible reasons why this is happening. Do you imagine that it will self-rectify, that the market will rectify, or that there could be a crash?
Well, certainly the authorities in New Zealand are in the process of trying to tighten up settings and trying to slow it down by tightening up the amount of lending that can go to investors. And certainly that's something that may have some impact in terms of slowing it in the short run. We think that might have some effect. Your question as to whether it will end up being a collapse or not. Look, we think that's unlikely. We think the housing market will slow down, and we don't think that this is necessarily a financial stability risk for New Zealand. So in broad terms, rising house prices is a positive thing, and it is running a bit more quickly than seems sustainable. But it's not something that I would describe as a crisis.
Paul, we are exposed to an extent because of dairy prices that does affect our economy, and obviously dairy prices are very low at the moment. It is going to shave billions of dollars out of our economy. How much of a problem is that to us in real terms, do you think, going forward?
Well, it's certainly the softest sector in New Zealand at the moment, and that's because prices have come down a long way. You've had a drought, so you had less production in the first quarter as well. But you've got to keep in mind that the New Zealand economy isn't just dairy. It's not just a dairy economy. There are other things that are driving the story at the moment, and those things don't get the same sorts of headlines. Firstly, of course, Auckland is building more houses. There is a construction upswing that's underway in Auckland, and that's a key support for growth. And secondly, of course, the Canterbury rebuild is still ongoing, so that's driving growth as well. The combination of those two things has been creating more jobs are being created, and so people are doing more spending. That's supporting your economy, running at about 3%.
Are you of the view, Paul, and you monitor this very closely, of course, are you of the view that the national government in New Zealand is doing a good job managing the economy?
I do think so, yes. I think that the government has made a number of reforms that are helping to support this ongoing growth in New Zealand, and certainly those reforms have been helpful, I think, in terms of getting the economy to grow at the pace that it's at.
All right, so going forward, Paul, what is your estimation right at the moment? For instance, if we just look at our two countries, we are a rock star. Australia is experiencing severe problems. Moving forward, do you think that we will, in, say, 5 years' time, be in the same situation we're in now compared to Australia?
Well, that's the challenge, really. The challenge is to continue with a reform agenda that continues to support New Zealand's growth over time. There's no doubt that New Zealand will go through cycles still, so at some point in time there will be a downturn. We haven't got that penciled in for next year. We think it's probably beyond that horizon, but we think that New Zealand will continue to do well.
Good to know. Good to know that you haven't got it penciled in, a downturn for the next year. Paul, thank you so much for joining us. Paul Bloxham, HSBC Chief Economist, Australia and New Zealand. So.